parents should have the possibility, if they so choose, to humanely end the life of a severely disabled infant after obtaining advice not only from the doctors but also from those with personal knowledge of what it's like to have a child with that disabilities.
My guest today is someone whose landmark 1975 book has been described as a philosophical bombshell. The publication of Animal Liberation helped inspire the modern animal rights movement. In it, Peter Singer provided a philosophical argument for overhauling humanity's treatment of animals. As well as condemning animal testing, the moral philosopher argued against eating meat, as animals had as much right to live free from pain and suffering as humans. Singer has now updated the book, taking into account all he considers has got better or worse for animals, and to consider the impact of climate change on farming and food production. Peter Singer is now a professor of bioethics at Princeton University, and the retitled Animal Liberation Now is out now. Peter Singer, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Great pleasure to have you. Look, to get started, briefly remind people about the central philosophy on which the arguments in the book are based.
The arguments of the book are based on the idea that species alone is not a morally relevant criterion, just as we now accept that race or gender is not a morally relevant criterion for giving people a lower moral status. So I argue that being of the species Homo sapien itself does not mean that you have a higher moral status than individuals of other species. Now, some of the things that typically go along with species, like levels of cognitive abilities, self-awareness, agency, might make a difference in some cases. But essentially, I argue that it's the capacity to suffer that is the base of having a moral status. And if you can suffer, then your suffering, your pain matters just as much as the pain of any other being, if it's a similar type of pain or a similar quantity of pain that you're experiencing.
You say matters, but matters to whom? Matters to us, matters to them, or matters in some sort of objective? I mean, we're not talking in some sort of theocratic level.
I'm certainly not a religious person, so I'm not talking on a theocratic level, but I think you can defend the idea that some things are objectively good and bad, even without any belief in God. So I think, for instance, to cause agony to a being for no reason is just clearly objectively bad. And to relieve the agony of a being is objectively good. So whenever we do inflict agony or even lesser degrees of suffering on beings, we need to ask ourselves, do we have an overriding reason that makes this so important that it justifies it? And I find that in the case of our treatment of non-human animals, typically we don't have those reasons, or we make light of their suffering. We think it's just much less important than the suffering of any human, even if it's a more severe kind of suffering, and even if the human desires or inclinations that we're trying to satisfy are not nearly as important for those humans as avoiding that suffering is for the animal.
Would it be fair to class your views as utilitarian, but expanding utilitarianism beyond humans as it normally is to suffering generally?
My views are certainly utilitarian personally, but in Animal Liberation and in Animal Liberation Now, I don't assume utilitarianism on the part of the reader. I argue in a more general way that you just can't justify, whatever your moral view, you can't justify the idea that being a member of the species Homo sapien somehow gives you a higher moral status. And yet that's what a lot of our thinking is based on, the idea that if you're human, you have basic rights. If you're not human, you probably have no rights at all, or maybe you have some very minimal rights. And it's interesting philosophically that a lot of philosophers who are not utilitarians now accept that view. Most recent is Martha Nussbaum, who published a book called Justice for Animals, which really comes from a more Aristotelian kind of perspective, but comes to similar conclusions.
The book was originally published in 1975, which is a while ago. Would you say that there have been positive developments in animal welfare since then?
There certainly, and fortunately, have been some positive developments over those 48 years. In particular, there have been developments in Europe, and I'm including the United Kingdom in that expression, in the regulation of some of the worst forms of confinement of animals in factory farms. So in the 1975 edition, I particularly talked about the bare wire cages for egg-laying hens in which they can't even stretch their wings, I talked about individual stalls for veal calves that they could not move or turn around in, and similarly for the sows, the mothers of the pigs who are then sent to market. Those things have been prohibited in the UK and the European Union, and in some states of the US, but actually not in most of the states of the US. So yes, there has been some progress, but there's still a long way to go, because even if you prohibit those extreme forms of confinement, the majority of animals people are eating are still kept inside all of their lives, very crowded. They've been bred to grow very fast, which causes serious welfare problems. So progress, yes. Are we there yet? Definitely not.
I think you said when you published this book you expected it to change the world, in your naivety. Do you think it has done?
Well, a lot of people credit it with giving rise to the modern animal rights movement. I think that's flattering. But that's been a big change in attitudes. Again, not really in the whole world. I don't think I've had an impact on attitudes to animals in China, for example, which is now also a huge producer of animals, overwhelmingly, again, factory farmed. So not worldwide, but I think in certainly the English-speaking world and basically the European world, I think I've had a significant influence, and in a number of other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And the new version you wanted, as well as other areas, you wanted it to address the prospect of climate change. Tell me about how climate change impacts on animal welfare.
I wanted the new book to address climate change because it does address the question of what we ought to eat. And although originally I approached that entirely from the perspective of animal welfare and what we're doing to animals, and then I added something about the waste of food that happens when you confine animals indoors and have to grow grain or soybeans to feed to them. But now I think we realize that there is a very important reason, and that is that meat is a major contributor to climate change. And in fact, it's one of the easier ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, because to stop eating meat, and particularly to stop eating the ruminant animals, the cows and sheep, who are the biggest producers of greenhouse gases, we don't really need any new technologies. We don't need to install new power grid or anything like that. We just have to reduce the large number of animals who are being raised for meat. And we have good alternatives already. I've been a vegetarian for over 50 years now, and a vegan for rather less than that, but for a few years. So I think that we can show that it can be done, that it's a healthy diet, that you can feel good on it, it's tasty. And so it's a relatively easy change to make.
Is there an ethical way to eat meat at all, or do we have to sort of cut that out?
You could find an ethical way, I think, or at least a way that would be defensible on some ethical views. If you have an ethic that says it's the pain and suffering that matters, not the killing, as long as that's done humanely, and as long as their lives are good, then maybe you can defend eating meat. But I think it's a very small part of the amount of meat that is produced nowadays, because that is so dominated by the industrialized production of animals.
Am I right in thinking you do eat some animals? You'll eat oysters, is that correct?
Yes, that's true. An oyster is an animal, so strictly when I said I've been a vegetarian or vegan, it's not quite right, because my concern is primarily about animal suffering. And on the evidence as I see it, and I talk about this in the book, I don't believe that oysters are likely to be able to suffer. And in terms of the environmental sustainability of ocean oyster farming, it does seem quite a sustainable industry. It actually helps to clean some water. So it's not that I eat oysters very often. I can't actually remember the last time I ate oysters, but I was just making the point that it's not a matter of kind of purity of not eating any animal products. It's a matter of thinking about the consequences of your diet.
AI, artificial intelligence, is one of the hot topics of the moment, and I know you're sort of considering how artificial intelligence, AI, affects animals. What are the big considerations there?
Again, the biggest consideration in terms of numbers is that AI is being used in factory farms now to monitor the animals, to regulate things like temperature and food supply. And those things in themselves may not really be harmful. They do distance humans from the animals. And you could say that's a bad thing if the humans were sympathetic to the animals, but since many workers in farms, they're themselves hard worked, and it's not very pleasant working conditions. So sometimes they take out their frustrations on the animals, and maybe AI isn't going to do that. But the downside is likely to be that people will use AI to stock animals even more densely. They'll have this monitoring, and they'll be able to see whether the animals are healthy or not. But in terms of their well-being, because of the crowding that goes on, probably the AI will be programmed not to worry about that as long as the whole unit is more productive. And unfortunately with these units, the economics of it means that you can have a higher mortality rate because you're crowding and stressing the animals more, but you still get a higher return from your overall investment in the building and the equipment and the monitoring and the labour that goes into it.
What about the argument that like a self-driving car would be programmed to run over a dog rather than run over a human? Is that fine or is that wrong?
Well, if it's really a choice between killing the human and killing the dog, I suppose I would accept killing the dog, regrettably. And that would be because I think the human may have more to lose in terms of their sense of themselves, and perhaps the sense of loss of others might be greater. But I would be more troubled by a case where the AI is programmed not to swerve to avoid hitting the dog, if there is then some risk, even quite a small risk, of the car sort of running into a wall, something of that sort, which might damage the car but not injure the passengers. So I would want the AI to take serious account of the interests of the animals that run in front of it.
Your book in 1975 inspired and to some extent radicalised a generation of activists. What are your views on some of the sort of direct action that's followed from there?
I can support some forms of direct action where they are strictly non-violent. So I can support civil disobedience, as I supported civil disobedience for civil rights and against the Vietnam War and then a whole lot of other circumstances. But I've never supported the use of violence to defend animals. I think that that's wrong, and it's counterproductive. I know that happened particularly in the 1980s, and I think it was a major setback for the movement.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. When you were appointed to Princeton in I think 2000, wasn't it?
1999.
1999.
Yeah.
There was some protests over on the basis of a book you wrote in 1979, in which you suggested that the euthanasia of severely disabled infants could, in some circumstances, be justifiable. Is this something you still think, and how does that relate to your wider philosophy?
I still do think that parents should have the possibility, if they so choose, to humanely end the life of a severely disabled infant after obtaining advice not only from the doctors but also from those with personal knowledge of what it's like to have a child with that disability, so parents of children, or perhaps in some cases with the adults with that disability who are able to converse with you and discuss it. So, I think it should be an option. Is that related to my views about animals? Well, I suppose in the sense that yes, I don't think that there's a sanctity of human life that is separate from the way in which we think about animals. And if you think about animals and you have a dog or a cat who is suffering incurable disease or elderly and not going to get better, obviously the humane thing is to take your dog or cat to the vet and have their life ended peacefully. So I think that can also apply to humans, obviously for adults with their consent, but in the case of newborn infants, I think it's the parents who should be making that decision.
And I guess there are those who'd say this guy doesn't want to kill a chicken, but he'd let us kill a baby. You know, so you can see how people think they might.
I will relate. Kill a chicken if the chicken is suffering, as I just said, or a dog or a cat. I don't have a view about the sanctity of animal life at all, but I do think that we should end lives where there is no prospect of them improving. And in terms of doing that voluntarily, since I first wrote that book in 1979, of course, that movement has made a lot of progress. There are many countries in the world now that allow people to ask their doctor to end their lives, or ask their doctor to give them a prescription that they can themselves take to end their lives. In fact, I'm rather surprised that the United Kingdom is now lagging behind this. In Australia, which is my home country, we We have that throughout every state in Australia has it. Canada has it, many states in the United States, and of course your near neighbours like the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, even formerly Catholic countries like Portugal and Spain. So I don't know what's up with the United Kingdom. Why are you not allowing people to make those choices?
This is just the way we roll in a whole variety of directions these days, I would say. Look, before I let you go, you mentioned at the start that you feel your views have not had as much traction in perhaps China as elsewhere. China, of course, eats a lot of meat and a hugely increasing amount of meat. What are your I was going to say hopes is too optimistic. What are your expectations for the future about the sort of global well-being of animals? Do you think we are heading broadly in the right direction, or do you think, look, the picture is still horrific?
I do think the picture is still horrific, and China is one reason why I think that, because as you say, it's hugely increased its meat production as it's become more prosperous, which in itself is a good thing, but it has this negative consequence. I think to move countries like China in the right direction, we will need to make progress with producing either plant-based products that are similar to meat in their taste and the way they cook and chew, or also cultivated meat, that is meat grown at the cellular level, which is still meat, but did not involve any animal, does not release nearly as many greenhouse gases. And if we can do that, and it can be economically competitive with meat as well as tasting similarly, then I think we'll be able to win over the world as a whole.
Well, Animal Liberation Now is out now. Peter Singer, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. It's been good talking with you.